Lukas Barfield. Welcome back to On the Record. Today we are joined by science fiction author and poet Y.M. Payne. She has been published in Asimov Science Fiction and Fantasy, the Magazine of Science Fiction and Fantasy, Little Blue Marble, Strange Horizons, Cast of Wonders, Factor 4 number 3, and several other online publications. I am happy to welcome to the show today Y.M. Payne. How are you doing today, Y.M.?
Not too bad. Hi, I'm Y.M. Payne, or you can also call me Michelle. It's kind of a slightly chilly day here in Toronto, but that's part of the course for December.
Yeah, that's kind of how we are over here on the West Coast in Tacoma. And I wanted to have Michelle on today because I came across one of her stories in the September-October edition of Asimov Science Fiction. It's a magazine out there if you haven't heard of it. A really great magazine, and they focus on fantasy stories too, not just science fiction stories. And I was reading along, and I came across her story called The Mangy White Dog. And I wanted to have her on to talk about it. I really like the story. I want to kind of jump right into it. But before we get into the more of the plot of the story, I wanted to have Michelle talk about the characters of the story.
Well, there is the narrator, who is called Sunflower, who is a cat. And there is the title character, the Mangy White Dog, who is a dog. And we also have Sunflower, the main character, is sort of owner/partner Taihu. So that's the human character in the story. So I would say these are the three characters that the story revolves around.
Yeah, and there's an old lady right at the beginning of the story, too, that kind of changes the story there for a minute. We will get to her in a minute, but I wanted to ask you the setting of the story. There's a couple streets in the story. I don't think you ever say exactly where it's set. Do the streets give away a particular city that it is in the world, or is this an imaginary city or a place?
Well, I made up the street names, so this is not like a real city I'm thinking of, but I'm basing it on sort of northern China, which is where I was born, and that's sort of where a lot of sort of the, I guess, the culture, like around like the market and like the like, you know, the streets and the sort of that's sort of where the setting comes from. So it's sort of, I guess, it's a city, it's a fictional city that is set in northern China, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's kind of the impression I got. I just want to kind of double check that because it has a market in it, and one of Sunflower's favorite food to eat is ribbon fish, which I'm not familiar with that. I've heard about actually Japan, I think, eat a lot of ribbon fish. Am I mistaken?
I wouldn't be able to speak for Japan. In Chinese, we call it daiyu. I was debating between like just calling it daiyu or calling it ribbon fish in the story. Anyway, I decided to settle on ribbon fish. But it's sort of when sort of for my like for my like my mother, like it was like for her like she really likes it because compared to the other types of fish they'd be able to have in her generation, it was one of the best. I still eat it occasionally at home. I would say it's not particularly like, I guess, like it's very, how do I describe it? Like it's a sea fish, I believe. So it's like, it doesn't have, the way my mom would describe it is that like her, like, so a lot of the river fish have this sort of like sort of soil and sort of that like river taste to it. Whereas because river fish is that sea fish, it doesn't have that taste. So that's why it's pretty popular. But I would say like compared to like, you know, like salmon or something, I wouldn't say it's the most posh fish out there.
Yeah. A little more tamer taste, kind of like a halibut, because out in the sea it has less of that sort of like you were talking about, like an earthy taste. I know Sunflower really likes that. That's one of her favorite things. Mm-hmm. This story has a lot of like we were just talking about how much we like fish, and the main character, how much you like fish, and your mother likes fish, the main character likes fish. There's a lot of human traits in this story and different emotions and things going on. Why did you choose animals to tell the story and not necessarily humans?
I just, like, one of my favorite authors, like, growing up is Kenneth Oppel. I don't know if he wrote the Silverwing series, which is actually about bats. And, that was one of my big inspirations as, during, like, junior high and stuff, like, sort of like that sort of like 8 to 12 age range. And I was just very fascinated by, like, how he was able to make these, like, bats who, like, weren't really my favorite animals going into the books, but he was able to sort of craft such, like, interesting, complex, like, characters, and it didn't, like, feel silly, and like, I just always wanted to write, like, a talking animal story, but in a serious way. And like, he's also talked about sort of how he never liked the type of sort of like anthropomorphized talking animal stories where, like, like the rats are like sitting around drinking tea and like wearing aprons or something. But instead he wanted to sort of like make the bats, like, for example, he never describes color in the books because bats don't see in color. So like, he wanted to sort of show them as like them, but also have like personalities and sort of depth to them. And that's kind of what I wanted to do here, like a talking animal story, but I guess a darker talking animal story.
Yeah, and you can kind of give animals a little extra characteristics that you can't always give people. And this story that you wrote is definitely an example of that. Sunflower, we'll get to some of her traits here in a minute, but she does some things later on in the story that you might not be able to write into a human doing. So the next thing I wanted to ask you about is, what were you doing when you first got this vision of this Mangy White Dog main character?
I must have been in downtown Toronto. So even though I didn't end up setting the story in Toronto for various reasons, but I think I must have been downtown Toronto near Dundas Square. I think I was still going to class at that time. I think I must have seen like a big white dog there. Obviously, like I assume like my real life dog had an owner and a home and everything, rather than like my poor mangy white dog in the story. But just seeing that dog sort of walking around downtown was like I guess the sort of phrase mangy white dog just came into my head. And this is going to sound really stupid because in retrospect, I don't know why I thought this, but a part of me was like, I'll just like write this little like 1,000 word like flash fiction and like about this. And then like I realized that I'd written 1,000 words and barely gotten through like the first 2 scenes or something. So I was like, well, I guess this is a full short story now.
One of the characters that I mentioned, there is an old lady right at the beginning of the story, and she's dressed in kind of drab brown clothes, and she has a really stark yellow scarf on. And the color is sometimes you bring that up from time to time in the story. Of course, you got White Dog is in the title of the story, and it sounds like Sunflower's kind of like thinking about what happened. And she says that the old lady was there with her and her human watching their performance, and then she left, and that like changed the bones of the universe. I was wondering if you'd like to share with us something that maybe had happened to you, like one little thing happened and it changed everything in your universe.
I mean, I can go like the big picture things, such as coming to Canada, the pandemic in 2020. Let's maybe go with something small. There was a point in my life I was sort of doing an internship, and there was a point during it where it got very upsetting, and mostly due to like sort of my own struggles and like my feelings of being inadequate, blah blah blah. Then a part of me was like, I'm gonna hop on the plane and go back to Toronto. I'm not finishing this thing. I can't do it anymore. And I guess I chose not to hop on that plane, and I chose to stick it out and finish the internship, and that's why I have a job right now. And it's just sort of those like little decisions, I guess, that like you make sometimes, or things that like, you know, sometimes that things that happen like to you, like for example, when like, I guess if we're going to stick with the job topic, when like, you know, someone mentioned I was in some kind of like sort of group with the career center, that was many years ago, and someone, you know, we were writing down sort of like our dream careers from when we were kids, and then someone was like, then we were sort of looking at sort of similarities between the different careers people mentioned. Someone was like, hey, like seems like sort of a lot of sort of your careers like talk about sort of like health and safety and stuff. And I'm just like, I never would have realized that if like that person hadn't pointed it out. But like due to that person pointing it out, that sort of set me down a different path in terms of like my career choices and my education choices from then on.
So I was wanting to know if you would read the first confrontation between Tehu and Sunflower and the Mangy White Dog. This is when Sunflower is on Tehu's shoulder and they're coming down the path, and the Mangy White Dog like tries to step out in front of them for a couple days, and then finally he kind of corners them, and there's actually a confrontation between the three of them. Could you read that to us?
Yeah, I can read a little bit of it. I'll start with I left onto Taihu's shoulders. Does that work?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. I left onto Taihu's shoulders, and we started the familiar journey down Tianlu. But after a few steps, Taihu stopped. The mangy old dog stood before us. His fur had acquired new missing patches, and his left hind limb could no longer extend to the ground. He stared at us. With those pleading, moon-gray eyes. Taihu's mouth tightened. You're in the way, I told the dog. His eyes remained fixed on Taihu. Taihu stomped forward, wearing an intimidating scowl. The dog backed off, but remained in the middle of the walkway. Taihu made him walk around the dog, but the dog mirrored his every step. Just run past him, I said. I want to go home. I want ribbon fish. But as usual, Taihu did not understand me. He turned back to the dog. Go away, he said. The mangy dog barked. His teeth were as yellow as that old woman's scarf. Taihu made a shooing motion with his hand. Go away! By now, passing pedestrians and a vendor was staring at us. Taihu finally managed to maneuver around the dog and dash away. I glanced back. The dog didn't chase us, just whimpered and hung his head.
There's a lot of imagery in there with the dog and a lot of different things going on with the Mangy White Dog. And you did use the word old there as an adjective to describe the Mangy White Dog. And you were talking about the dog earlier that you saw in downtown Toronto. Well, why did you choose the word mangy and not three-legged old dog or just old dog? Or what do you think about that word mange?
I think it just sort of like encompasses all those different things in one. And it also, like, words aren't just about what they mean, but also how they sound, right? So, like, mangy white dog has a certain cadence to it compared to, like, old white dog. Or not to say one is invalid, but it just has a certain sort of musicality to it almost.
So the mangy white dog won't go away, and he keeps coming back, and it keeps getting Sunflower more and more frustrated. And then there's a point in the story where she discovers why the mangy white dog is coming around. And it's really of a sort of a betrayal to her, and she's really upset, and kind of things start going downhill for Sunflower at this point. What are some but she doesn't give up. Sunflower never gives up. She's really set on her mission, for good or bad. What are some other characteristics that you try to write into the character of Sunflower?
Would it be fair to call my little kitty a anti-hero? That's sort of what I was sort of going for. She's very, like you said, she's very determined. She's determined to, be a very good, because like throughout the, like, basically she's introduced as magic cat, right? She can do all these tricks that like real / other cats can't do. She can sort of like flip balls around and like jump through hoops and everything, and that's why she and Taihe, her human, are partners here, right? And she's very determined to sort of be the best at this. In fact, she almost like sort of envisions herself as an athlete, and there's actually a point in the story that makes that very clear. But at the same time, she has like these like negative qualities, such as she's quite possessive. She she's not particularly sympathetic to animals or humans that aren't her, and she can be very ruthless if like you cross her. And but at the same, it's sort of this, I guess, writing the story, it's sort of about striking that balance between like, do I want the readers to feel sympathetic towards her? Do I want the readers to condemn her? And I think both of those things are valid.
Yeah, and I think you did a masterful job kind of going back and forth between that on a couple of the characters. But I wanted to talk about the human character for a second, Taihe, and he goes through the story, and he's very sort of a benign figure. He's definitely not in the background, but he doesn't ever really do anything necessarily bad. But he's really kind of the main. Sunflower is all those things you said, and she is a anti-hero, but really all the problems are coming from the human. Do you see this as a thing, just a general trait of humans a lot of times, to be causing a lot of problems, but not necessarily recognize that they are the issue?
So I always say there are two types of people in this world. There's one type, which is, it's all my fault. It's all my fault. If the sky falls down tomorrow, it's my fault. I blame myself, blah, blah. And then there's a second type, which is, it's never my fault. It's never my fault. Doesn't matter. It's like just not my fault. And we can probably guess what type Taihe is, and not just say like the second. Again, this is probably a bit too absolute. Obviously, it's probably more a range than like two groups, but Taihe is very much, he doesn't like necessarily take responsibility. I guess that's what you were alluding to earlier. And I guess from his perspective, he's not necessarily doing anything wrong other than looking out for himself, which is exactly what Sunflower is doing, right? So, but it's sometimes you just kind of like run across the field and forget that you trampled a bunch of flowers.
Sunflower, a couple times in the story, even recognizes that Taihe doesn't listen to her. And she kind of chalks it up to just, humans don't listen anyway, so I'm just going to not even worry about it. But she definitely says a couple times, like, maybe he'll listen this time. But he never seems to.
Well, I think what he did, like, the whole, like, conception here is that she understands him, but he doesn't understand her. And she keeps hoping that he will understand her and like sort of, I guess, recognize that she too is, like she is capable of speech and she's like, she can talk to him, but like he just never understands her. So there's nothing like, that's sort of the barrier there. And then obviously once the Mangy Dog comes into it, that adds another layer regarding like, does the dog understand? Like, is it like maybe the dog does understand and, Sunflower just can't understand him? And it's all about it's sort of like language, but not quite language, because like sort of one person can sort of communicate, but the other person isn't receiving anything. So.
Yeah, and that does happen a lot, whether it's at work or between couples or just between friends. A lot of times, and it's kind of going on a lot right now because there's a lot of stress out there. So people are talking, and definitely like our government systems and politicians, a lot of times people are talking, but just nobody listens. But a lot of the times the person that is not being listened to, kind of like Sunflower, they'll try to justify it. Like, oh, it's just kind of the way it is. But then they keep trying. Like, she never gives up on trying to talk to the Mangy White Dog or Taihe.
Yeah, like she just... Like, it's sort of represented in the story as Taihe just genuinely can't understand Sunflower, right? Because she's a cat, but like she can understand him, and like that's sort of like the problem is she can understand him, so that sort of gives like a very different dynamic to the whole thing. And obviously she's always, I think, hoping for something more to the partnership and for something like, something more there than maybe he was looking for potentially. And that sort of plays into why like she cannot forgive certain things as well.
So we are going to move on towards the end of the story. I want to remind the audience that at the end of this and then after the show, Michelle will be reading the story on Radio Tacoma. So we're going to try not to spoil the story for you. We're discussing it. I want to talk really quickly about at the end, the Sunflower and the Mangy White Dog, they kind of make up in sort of a weird way. Do you think that people that are so sort of opposed to each other as Sunflower and the Mangy White Dog, their viewpoints are so far apart, do you think they can ever really reconcile?
Well, I think it just depends on like the people involved, right? If you have two sort of very, I guess, and also like why exactly they are opposed, right? Because in this case, Sunflower and the Mangy White Dog, they're not really opposed in terms of like their personalities or their ideologies per se, though obviously their personalities and ideologies are completely different, but that's not what actually brings them into conflict. It's something outside of themselves. And once that something outside of themselves is removed, that sort of gives them an avenue to sort of feel differently about each other, and for maybe one party to potentially reach out a hand, not to say the other party will necessarily take it. I think people like arch enemies can make up, but it's all about like whether there's an opportunity or like a willingness to even do so. Because I find what usually ends up happening is people just kind of drift apart, right? Like instead of having like a big fight or big like reconciliation, people just kind of move on with life and slip away, and that's usually what happens.
And that is kind of what happens at the end of the story. And it seems when Sunflower's looking back, and especially at this point when she tries to reconcile with the Mangy White Dog, and like I said, she does in some ways. There's a lot of regret there where you can kind of tell, and it kind of go back to the old lady when she leaves and she says the bones of the universe change. It's kind of like Sunflower's looking back going, oh, I wish this would have been different, you know?
Oh, I think she definitely wishes a lot of things were different, like with the Mangy White Dog, especially as she grows to understand him more in the end. And I think like it's sort of, she's caught between this place of like, I wish this could have turned out differently. But at the same time, I don't think she has a very concrete answer to what she could have done.
One of the big themes of the story is survival and kind of doing what it takes to survive. And I think that's a really big thing that we can think about today in 2020 and 2021 is, sometimes survival is not always pretty, and you just never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's just sometimes like life isn't just about sort of doing things you want to do, right? It's sometimes about sort of doing things you don't want to do in order to survive, or in order to reach a goal, or in order to sort of, make something happen. It's so difficult sometimes. Like, and again, little peek behind the curtain. Obviously, I don't know if readers realize this, but this was definitely written long before 2020. I think first draft must have been 2018. I'm trying to remember when this actually got accepted to Asimov's, but usually there's like a huge delay in these markets. Like they would accept a story maybe like 6 months, sometimes to a year in advance, and then they plan out their issues. So again, this was written and I believe accepted long before, but I'm gonna have to double check that. Yeah, so this was accepted back in February. So like that was like right before, I guess, any sort of lockdown hit us. So yeah, and I wrote it back in 2018. So this wasn't like in response to coronavirus, but I'm glad it I guess, managed to play a part in the zeitgeist.
Yeah, it definitely has added to the zeitgeist. But I wanted to ask you, the Mangy White Dog has all kinds of symbolic qualities. What does the Mangy White Dog symbolize to you?
I think he symbolizes loyalty, and he symbolizes desperation, but not necessarily loyalty in a positive way and not necessarily desperation in a bad way.
All right, Michelle, thank you for the great interview. And I wanted to ask you, is there anything you wanted to leave us with before we close and hear your great story, The Mangy White Dog?
Thank you so much for inviting me, Lucas. If you, for any listeners out there, if you want to check out more of my work, you can visit my website, www.ympang.com. I have around a dozen different short stories published. At least 2 more stories will be coming in 2021 as well.
Thank you so much for being on Radio Tacoma, Michelle. You can listen to Y.M. Pang read her story, The Mangy White Dog, by clicking the link in the description.